Welcome to Safe on Deck. For episode 31, I spoke with Scott Dworkin via phone at his home in Thousand Oaks, California. As both an aerial photographer and defense writer, Scott has flown with and covered every branch of the United States Armed Forces, and he's worked with numerous Department of Defense contractors, civilian aviation outfits, and law enforcement aviation units. Scott is one of only a handful of civilians in the world that are privileged to fly as an aerial photographer in high-performance military aircraft, and he's attended the United States Air Force Physiological Training Program and was qualified as a United States Naval Project Specialist. Scott's career in defense photojournalism included many projects, one of the highlights being when he embedded with the Air Force's 452nd Airlift Wing and traveled with them to Afghanistan to cover the story of their aeromedical evacuation mission. Scott's work led him to being hired by the Air Force Flight Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base as a full-time flight test photographer. While there, he provided aerial multimedia, both air-to-air and air-to-ground coverage, including still photography, high-definition videography, high-speed video, and post-production. Scott routinely flew aboard various Air Force aircraft to provide documentation of ordnance and weapons testing, drop tests, aircraft flight performance, and other operational and flight test-related missions. Scott also has worked as a contracted flight test photographer, videographer for the Naval Air Warfare Center Weapons Division, Naval Test Wing Pacific, at both Point Mugu and China Lake. Currently, Scott flies in support of the Boeing Flight Test Multimedia team as part of numerous ongoing aircraft development programs throughout the company, along with still doing projects for publication as well as other contract work. Scott recently published his first book, Becoming the Rhino, a beautifully illustrated, in-depth look at the men and women behind Strike Fighter Squadron 122, based at Naval Air Station Lemoore. Thanks for taking the time to listen. In the future, I plan to continue to share similar interviews with both current and retired military aviators. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future interview, please leave it as a comment below. Safe on Deck, episode 31 with Scott Dworkin. Enjoy. Okay, Scott, there's been a little bit of back and forth, you and I trying to figure out the time to make this work. This is my first interview doing this not in person, so we're doing it over the phone. So thanks again for making everything work and figuring out a time for us to make it happen. So I begin all these interviews the exact same way. I'll start yours the same way as well. Where were you born?
I was born in Los Angeles, actually, where I still live today.
Still in LA. So, man, I've been to California once in my life. It was actually this summer to get to go do some flying out at Miramar. I've never been up to LA, though. Tell me about LA.
There's not much else I can say that isn't probably already known. I live north of Los Angeles now in Thousand Oaks, which is, if you were in downtown LA, it's about an hour on a good day with no traffic, north going towards Santa Barbara. I was born in Santa Monica, which is kind of in LA, and lived most of my up to college years in the San Fernando Valley. So people that are listening that are from this area would understand what I'm talking about. You probably won't, but it's all good. LA is huge. That's the best thing I can say about it. I love where I live now. Let's put it that way. LA is a big, busy place, and it can be stressful. It can be fun. It can be all things to all people. Where I'm at is a little bit more rural. There's hills and trails and animals and stuff where I live. Again, it's 45 minutes to an hour from downtown, about an hour and 20 minutes from the airport from LAX, but you would never know it. So that's why I moved out here when I met my wife. She's from here, and I've been here ever since. The only pause in between was I went to school in San Diego. You mentioned you went out to Miramar for a det. I lived pretty much on the takeoff end of Miramar's runway for over a year, which was a lot of fun, sitting on my balcony every day. This was during Navy days, so it was actually Top Gun and F-14s flying over all day up till 10 at night. That was a good time. So yeah, that was it. That's where I'm at now. And, like I said, LA is LA.
That's probably the best way to say it. I like it. One thing I want to kind of point people towards, because you have an awesome story and an awesome history in aviation and photography, especially. I think it's Hangar Z. I want to make sure I get their name right. The Hangar Z podcast.
Correct.
So that was one that you sent me not too long ago. I want to say 2-3 hours. It's lots of detail, but I loved every little bit of it. And you talked about from the very foundation, where you found your love for aviation and photography specifically, and how you made a career out of it. Can you give me like maybe not 10-second elevator pitch, but how did you get into photography? Why military aviation specifically, and how have you made it a career up to now?
Yeah, and that's a great point. Like John, who does the Hangar Z podcast, is a police officer, helicopter pilot that I've known for years. He started this podcast, and we went into some fairly lengthy conversations, which is what we were trying to do in that case. But in your case, I think the best way I can sum it up is it's not really any one thing. I just, as a kid, loved airplanes. I think every, little boy and little girl to some degree loves, wants to be a firefighter, a pilot, all those cool things. That's kind of what I wanted to do. I don't have a distinct one-off memory of anything in particular. I remember my parents taking me to Van Nuys Airport, which is a large general aviation, actually the busiest general aviation airport in the country, I believe still, to some air shows that they had when I was probably, 8 or 9, I don't remember. And that kind of did something, obviously. And then as I kind of got a little bit older, I would go to a lot of air shows with them, driving me, and Edwards, Point Mugu, Miramar, anything on the West Coast, I pretty much went to with my parents. My mom and dad always had a camera, a film camera, like a Canon AE1, was always just for vacations and things like that. It wasn't anything professional. My parents were not. I have no military background in my family, and I have no photography background in my family. So it wasn't like either or was something I was exposed to because it was just something we did. We went to air shows because I loved airplanes, and that got that bug going. And I started learning how to take pictures with their camera. If I have some of the photos still, and they're 4x6s that you'd have to take to the little photo mat during the week, pick them up a few days later, or the drugstore, and you get them back, and I look at them now, and they're like, F-14s, which was awesome that I got to shoot those, but they're little specks. It wasn't a great camera. It was just a regular Canon camera. So there wasn't any, like I said, there was just a lot of, and in the other podcast, I talk about some of the series of events that expanded on my interest, whether it was building models, buying magazines, buying books by Peter Heatley or Ted Carlson, seeing his photos, or later on like Eric Hildebrandt, some of those folks that I would see in the magazines. That kept my interest going. So the end of all that in the short version was I did want to go into the military. I wanted to be a pilot. Again, without having any context of a family background, it was just something I was going to pursue with no real, not my parents supported it, but it wasn't like the top of our list of what I was going to do. There was a period of time, obviously, when the first Top Gun came out, that strongly influenced my decision to try to go into the Navy. I think like everyone else at the time that saw it. So, my parents had a deal with me that they wanted me to go to college. I did not have the grades to go to any of the academies. So I went to school in San Diego. Their deal with me was, we know you want to be a pilot. We'd like you to go to college for 1 year just to go see what college is like. And if you still want to do that, if you have to join ROTC, or I was going to do OCS or OTS, depending on which service branch. But I walked into the Navy ROTC office at the beginning of the second semester of my freshman year, and they basically looked at me and they said, nope, not going to happen. This was after the first Gulf War had ended already. There was a huge drawdown. So they kind of said, nope, we're not taking anybody that says they want to fly in the Navy. Go talk to the Air Force. And that's what I did. I walked down the street, went to the Air Force ROTC detachment. They said the same thing. Basically, we don't have a lot of pilot slots, but we have more pilots and flying jobs in the Air Force, so we'd love to have you. And I did that. But again, couldn't get a pilot slot. So basically, the gouge that I was getting from our ROTC detachment commander was, look, we love you. You're a strong student. I was like a B student, not an engineer. I had a psychology degree, or was going towards a psychology degree. And he was just basically straight with me and said, it ain't going to happen. Nobody's getting pilot slots out of ROTC right now. It's all going to the academy and all going to engineering students. So he let me voluntarily walk out of the program. Although I was committed, I didn't take any scholarship money, so I had nothing that I was owed to the government. It was just, I'd already signed the paperwork to go to basic and do all that stuff in the summer. He let me walk. So passion and love for aviation, because it was a singular goal at that point in my early 20s, late teens, early 20s. Like, that's what I wanted to do, despite anything anybody else said. I was going to do this. And it just kind of ended. So graduated college, went into the business world, and put all that aside. I literally, stopped going to air shows, stopped buying the magazines, stopped building models, no photos, nothing. Just, it was basically like somebody passed away and I never dealt with it. I just moved on the next day. It's kind of my nature. And at some point down the line, I don't remember how many years, probably said it on the other podcast, but it doesn't matter. My parents, I think, said to me, it's really strange that you just put that all away. You shelved it away and you loved it so much, the airplanes and the photography. Why can't you do that without wanting to be a pilot necessarily? That's over. And they were right. And I ended up going to an air show. And as soon as I went the next time, it was like, oh yeah. And that's by that time when digital cameras first started coming around. And, met other photographers, started hanging out with other aviation photographers. And kind of that's where this part of my life started. I was working. I wasn't doing this full time at that point. I was working in my family business at that point, and just, would go to air shows like everyone else. But I was the guy that would go to the air shows with now I had my own camera, and I'd see, I'm standing behind 7 rows of people, heads in front, not getting really good photos. Obviously, there were websites too that had started up. Fence Check was a big one at the time, where people would post photos, whether they were critiquing them or not. It was just a place to post photos. Facebook wasn't even around at that point, I don't think. So I was the guy that would go to the air shows and see that and say, well, I hate having to get here at 4 a.m. or whatever it was to get in the front row. I would see this corner area where it said like media or whatever it said, and photographers would be lined up right on the front row. And I just started asking questions, man. It was like, how do you get to that? Well, here's what you need to do. Once I got there, it was like, well, how do you get to this? Well, here's what you need to do. That eventually led to me pulling out all those magazines and books that I had stored away at my parents' house, and then buying new ones and saying, well, how did these guys get to do this? I mean, that was as fundamental as it was. It was, these names are not military people. I can tell there's no rank put in front of them. I could see the names. I knew the names of some of these people, like I mentioned. And I would start asking pilots, hey, how did this guy get to do the air-to-air photography? Well, we're not really sure. We're told to fly him around, but we can certainly ask for you. So I had a few pilots, a few people throughout the last decade or so, decade plus at this point, that were willing to ask those questions on my behalf, and they ended up helping me pursue this more professionally. That's the short version.
No, that's perfect. And I was going to say, truly, I would encourage anyone that wants to hear the long version. I'm not really usually into, well, I guess there's a couple podcasts I'll endorse. Definitely that one with Hangar Z. Truly, you really get into the weeds, into the details. But I kind of want to jump around because I'm fortunate that I know the details and I know a little bit about your history. At one point in your past, you worked at Edwards Air Force Base as a
Correct.
photographer flying in the back of, multiple aircraft. I was wondering, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I find that super, super fascinating. I know nothing about how they do things at Edwards.
Okay, so again, without going into all the details of how that job fell into my laps, it literally did. It was, I was doing freelance work as a photographer, part-time, working in my family business, had already started flying a bit, with the Air Force, the Navy. I had flown with the Navy at this point once. And I was doing a project on behalf of a magazine with the Air Force Reserve Command, flying in a tanker. And I embedded with them. And this was the tanker unit at a March Air Reserve Base here in Riverside, California. I had done a lot of work with them. They had asked me to go with them to cover their air refueling missions. And they sent me with their tanker to Edwards. Well, Edwards is a place, as I just mentioned, that I sort of grew up going to the air shows. I was very familiar with. And I also knew what they did out at Edwards, which is flight test, a lot of secret stuff, a lot of stuff that's not for public. And, there's this mythology around Edwards. It is kind of one of the most famous military installations in the world, and historical, things out there that you'd see, that just every piece of aviation history in the Air Force, in all the military, is there. But I knew when they sent me there, I said, this is the wrong place to be sending a photographer. They don't want photographers hanging around there. So lo and behold, they worked it out. And while I was out there, the primary mission that the tanker unit was supporting happened to be F-35. And it was pretty early on in the F-35 program. That's where the consternation came from, of me being in the tanker as a civilian. But Lockheed got involved, the Air Force got involved, everyone got involved and said, okay, we're cool with this. It's a good story. Really, he's there to cover the tanker mission and the reservists supporting the mission, not the F-35 per se. It was just whatever was in the window. And refueling was what I was there to shoot, but it wasn't necessarily, could have been an A-10, didn't matter. That's what sold them on letting me do it. It's like, I'm not really concerned with what's in the window. It's that they're refueling and supporting the mission. So I went out there to do this work, and while I was out there for the week, the Lockheed photographers, so to go back to your original thing, what happens at Edwards, it's a very unique base in the sense that there's a lot of contractors out there. I don't know the exact number anymore of how many military to civilian it is, but it's a large contractor and government employee base as opposed to the size of the military footprint. So you have every company out there, Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop, they're all there. And many of them have huge staffs of people. Lockheed has their own aerial photography shop that had, anywhere from 3 at various times to 6 to 7 photographers. And the photographer there was tasked with every day coming and checking my camera, reviewing the photos, and making sure that I could leave the base at the end of the week with nothing that was obviously classified or of the F-35, which in the air really wasn't. But through meeting him, he sort of subtly said to me, have you ever thought of doing this full time? Like, what is freelance like? What is part-time? How do you make a living? And blah, blah, blah. These conversations just sort of went around, and he said, there's a job here on the base, not for Lockheed, but the Air Force has another contract that supports the 412 Test Wing, which is the test wing at Edwards. That's the Air Force Test Wing. And he said, you should go apply. because very few people show up with having some experience at all. Some that they've hired had only limited photography experience. Here I'd already flown, done a lot of work with the government, published a lot of articles in magazines around the world. And it just happened that he mentioned that. He just threw it out. So there was another person out there that I had known for years at the test pilot school at Edwards, which is where the Air Force Test Pilot School is. I went to say hi to him. He sort of said the same thing the next day, just didn't know that had come up already. But said, Scott, you have such a passion for this and you're so, talented and you're such a supporter of the military. There's a job here that I think you'd be perfect for. And so I literally walked into the office and sort of started chatting with one of the photographers and met the woman who would become my boss. And a few months later, they hired me. The job itself was basically supporting any of the missions that the Air Force had. And there's all kinds of missions. There's things as simple as shooting on the ground. Hey, we're going to load this widget on the wing of this airplane, and we need somebody there with a video camera that's going to take frame by frame for engineering analysis, like this thing and how it loads onto the wing hard point on an F-16. So some of it's not like super exciting. We also supported public affairs a lot. So at the base, so there'd be like, hey, we're having a change of command or a retirement, and they were super busy over there. So we would say, well, we'll go over and shoot it. But at the same time, there were a lot of flights, between airdrop. I always found the most ironic thing that I ever worked on out there was there's a whole department at Edwards that the Air Force has called test parachutes. So basically Air Force pararescue men who are special forces type of guys with tons of experience that end up at Edwards like a test pilot would, but they're test parachutists. And we would go up in aircraft and we would test, not necessarily always people jumping out, but just different types of pallets and different types of airdrop mechanisms, mostly out of C-17s. Those are always really interesting missions to me because I love the C-17. It was always fun to fly in it. And just seeing the way that they were always trying to work within what they had. People are used to the government and huge, massive programs like F-35 or the Ford-class carrier, trillions of dollars. There are a lot of things that the Air Force and the DoD do that are smaller. We used to call them like cats and dogs projects. And that's kind of what we did a lot. We would support that through video, photography, whatever, mostly for engineering purposes. These weren't photos that necessarily went out to the public for PR or to look cool. Obviously, the public affairs people would take our photos, and if there was something they could release, they would use them. But most of this was straight engineering type of work. The other side of the coin was because of Lockheed, and they had their own photographers, that we were somewhat restricted from what we could do with those type of programs. So like F-35, for example, it has changed now. I will say that. It has changed dramatically where there's more of a little bit more of a cooperative effort between the various photography shops at Edwards. But when I was there, honestly, you couldn't lift a camera up to take a photo of an F-35 if you weren't working for Lockheed. So it was kind of a political, but at the same time, I still got to see them every day. I got to be around them, but we weren't really working on behalf of that. We were working specifically for the Air Force Flight Test Center on their types of projects. So it's a unique place. It was a really interesting job. Like I said, there was a lot of politics out there. It was somewhat tiresome, to fight that. It wasn't my job because I wasn't the boss, but we'd hear about it. And because I was living in Thousand Oaks, which for those that don't have any context, Thousand Oaks to Edwards Air Force Base is 105-ish miles each way. Fortunately, I was going against traffic, but my wife did not want to move out that way to Palmdale or Lancaster. So when I was offered the job, she said, go do it, but we're staying here. So I was either going to go get an apartment out that way. I chose to commute. And so for just under a year and a half, I drove every day, about 210 miles a day to get to this job. And, people would think, why? Well, because of what you mentioned early on, is I was flying in these aircraft and I was trained to a standard. The Air Force required us to do the same types of training other than learning to fly that most aviators would go through, whether it's survival training, water survival, desert survival, things like that. So it's a pretty unique job and a pretty unique opportunity that I didn't want to say no to. It fell into my lap through conversation. But when I was actually offered the job, my wife said, look, take the job, but I don't want to necessarily pack up everything and move to Palmdale at this point until we know what really is going to happen. And so at the end of the day, a few other factors as well, but I ended up leaving because it was just a long, long commute. I would get up at 4:30, 5 in the morning, get to my office at 7:45-ish, 7:30, 7:45, and then go jump in a T-38 and fly around, and then come back and sleep on the couch in the back at lunch to try to get a nap in, knowing that I still had to edit photos, edit video, and then get in the car and drive home. So that was fun in the beginning and got really tiresome towards the end. So we'll say that.
You mentioned the T-38. I know you have some time in the back of a T-38, F-16, F-15. I'm guessing, was that it in terms of fast jets at Edwards?
They don't have F-15s at Edwards. They're at Eglin.
My mistake.
They were there way before I was ever there, obviously, and there's a lot of them sitting on poles in the museums and on the front of buildings. But no F-15s. It was basically F-16s, T-38s, B-52s, B-1, C-17, KC-135. And F-15s would come in primarily to support test pilot school training. TPS does a lot of dissimilar. I'm not an engineer, but I think that's what they call it. It's basically exposing the test pilots to every type of aircraft, even those out. And the Navy TPS does the same thing. They will bring in civilian aircraft, aerobatic type aircraft. They'll bring in, foreign, like MiGs from, Korea that are available here, say like at the Chino Air Museum. So the F-15s the E model would come in occasionally, a couple times a year, for TPS class work. And, got to sit in one, but I never flew in one.
Well, interesting. The reason why I was going to ask, first off, I've been told the F-15, the back seat, huge canopy, so you got a lot of room to get a camera back there. And I was just told that by a buddy that's got some backseat time in a Strike Eagle. But what was that first fast jet that you flew in for a photo mission? Do you remember? I'm assuming probably T-38?
For a photo mission? Because I actually flew in an F-16 when I was in ROTC in college, so in Arizona. But that was not for photos. That was like the hanging on for dear life and sent to flight that I was gifted. So, no, I had flown, I think, my numbers, I'm old now, so I don't know the dates, but I may have flown in an F-16 before that, and I had flown in a Super Hornet by that point. So, again, don't quote me on the dates. I don't remember, but no, it was not my first photo flight in a fast jet when I got there.
Okay, well, the only reason I ask is this past summer I had the opportunity twice to fly in a Super Hornet, and I realized, man, it's actually a really, at least in my mind, it was a smaller canopy than I was expecting it to be. You mentioned that first time you were in the F-16, it was for fun. It was a totally different experience. It wasn't a work experience. I was just kind of wondering what kind of training did that shop out at Edwards? Did they really? I mean, they're going to put you in the back of that airplane because they know you can do good work. Is it something that you'd had experience up to that point, and then you felt comfortable and ready to go, or was it you were kind of learning on the job, or a little bit of both? Maybe?
It's a great question. Yes and no. Yes, I felt like I had some experience, so I wasn't walking in cold. I knew what G-forces felt like. I knew what air sickness felt. All the things that you would assume. And for those that, you being a pilot yourself and having flown a lot, and me having flown quite a bit, not as much as you, obviously, but having the experience, one thing I try to explain to people is if you watch Maverick or Top Gun or go to an air show, you see these guys doing things in the demo or whatever, even in the movies or on documentaries. You have no idea what G-forces really feel like until you actually experience it. Even to this day, it's not enjoyable. It's not, I don't love it. It's just, it was an eye-opener from the very beginning to me to that part. So, but I had that some limited experience with that. Like even in a C-17, I have flown with C-17 crews where we were doing low level, in a big aircraft the size of an airliner, doing low level through the desert here, pulling obviously some G's, not probably 3, I don't know, but still the motion sickness feeling, that feeling that you get, I had that experience. But I will say, and it's a great question you asked, when I got to Edwards, everything shifted. The paradigm there was safety, safety, safety. My boss was a stickler. Flight test is a very meticulous, from the pilots themselves to the flight test engineers to the engineers and analysis on the ground. Everything is done. I mean, there is no messing around in flight test because we were part of that team in our capacity. It was also our responsibility to make sure that we were as safe as anybody else. And like I mentioned earlier, part of that contract and with the Air Force that allowed us to do that is the Air Force had rules. I mean, they change from time to time of what requirements, but the general gist of the requirements are you do go through egress training extensively. I mean, we had an F-16 and a T-38 egress trainer, like it's just sitting in a room. It's just an ejection. It's a fake cockpit, basically. And I would go there anytime. I mean, especially when I first started. It was just down the hall, and my boss would say, if you're not doing anything, just go sit in there and practice unhooking yourself from the seat. Practice the motions. And that's the same thing that you do, I'm sure, when you fly, getting that mental repetition. But there was also, like I said, I mean, it probably took me the first 3 months. Classes are hard to get into, especially because we're not military, so the priority goes to military. But at Edwards, it is a little different because there are a lot of flight test engineers that fly, photographers, etc. So they made a little bit more room in some of these classes, so that if there was, a safety class or a survival class, they would try to squeeze us in, even if it was full. So I was, like I said, I thought I knew everything. Everything's a bad word. I thought I knew what I was doing. And then I got there and my boss was like, pump the brake. You have rules now that are followed to the letter, as opposed to, I don't know what you did on the outside. I still had to, look, when I went to go fly to take photos in an F-16, even for a one-off flight, there's still training that you do the day of. There's still medical exams and things of that sort, but it's different. This was different. So we were required to take the same weekly testing that you do to stay in the green. Our flight data, like all of our stuff in the Edwards system, we would be green, yellow, or red. If something fell into the yellow, it was a class that we were missing or coming up on our, annual, we would have to go take care of it. So we're in the same system in scheduling as the pilot. So I always tell people, I did everything but basically learn to fly the airplane that the Air Force asked of us to do, to trust us to fly, whether it's in a, backseat of a jet or, a heavy aircraft or a tanker. We were considered air crew, so we had to follow those rules. It was a little bit of a shock. I mean, it wasn't what I expected initially. Let's put it that way.
So Scott, one of the cool things, I want to say it was 2019. I think it was actually, Sun and Fun 2019. I had a really good opportunity to fly down there with a friend. I'll just call him out, I guess. Mike, he's got a beautiful V-tail Bonanza with some custom photo windows in the back. Awesome airplane. And we did a couple flights down at Sun and Fun. And so, second biggest air show ride, I guess Oshkosh was probably the biggest. One of the flights we had with a TBM, and the TBM owner knew a couple other people, to include a Mustang pilot, an L-39 pilot. And it was kind of one of these, over beers, well, hey, it'd be really cool if we did a photo flight with, we got the TBM. It's a turboprop, low wing, awesome looking airplane. Got a P-51, have an L-39. So 3 dissimilar airplanes all joining on a V-tail Bonanza. And so good idea, Ferry, right? We kind of talked about it. And then all of a sudden the owners for all 3 airplanes rogered up. And then it was, hey, meet at this RV. We're going to brief this flight. And I'll never forget, I won't say the P-51 pilot's name, but he's pretty well known in this part of the world for air shows. And pretty sharp dude, right? And so we get there, and I think he turned to me and he said, "You the photographer?" And I said, "Yep." He goes, "Okay, you ready to brief?" And I almost was kind of like a challenge. Like everyone walks up to these folks at an air show, anyone with a camera, "Man, I would love to get air-to-air photos of your Mustang." And
right.
Everyone says that, right? And I was like, "Yes, sir." And then I was like, "Okay, cool." And I have my little briefing cards. I think I've sent you a copy that tons of awesome people have contributed to and helped me make. No, it was not a perfect brief. No, there were a lot of things that I needed to get better. But I think in that first minute, because I'm talking, but I'm also kind of listening, I looked at his face and his face changed, and the other people kind of were like, "Oh, this guy has a plan." And yeah, we made some modifications to the plan and it worked out great. We were safe and we got a couple cool, neat photos, but it always surprised me that I don't know if leadership is the right term for it, but when you're doing photos, especially air-to-air stuff, you have to be very, very precise. And a lot of photographers, and this is just my humble observation, other people will kind of set it up for them, and so they just press the button. That's the joke I always like to make. Hey, I'm just pressing the button. The people who are doing the hard work are the pilots. And that's true, but there's a little bit of direction that goes into it. When you were at Edwards, what was that process like? Were you the one being very directive? Did you know, hey, this is the photo or this is the video we need to come back with? What was that back and forth like for you working there?
Mostly the other direction. So we would go to briefings, multiple briefings. I mean, obviously there was preliminary. The X program, let's say, would contact the contract management for our photography shop and say, hey, in 6 months, we're going to do this. We were going to include photography in the test lineup, basically. There's a technical name, I'm drawing a blank, but you get my point. There's everybody that's going to be involved with the program gets kind of put in there. And part of that's budgetary as well, because again, even though we were an existing contract within the Air Force, it's paid for. So there's budgeting items that have to go in early. But as the program would progress, and this wasn't necessarily my thing as just you kind of said the guy clicking. I used to always joke, like, we're just the monkeys with the cameras, but my boss was privy to a lot of the emails that would go back and forth over the many months leading into, sometimes they're shorter, but a lot of times a long duration, where it would be like, okay, here's this, here's what we're doing, and where appropriate would, within those briefings, or if it was a meeting that she would go to, she would come back and say, okay, they talked for 2 hours about everything else, all the engineers, all the stuff they're going to do. And then they would look at her and say, here's what we need you to do. Here's what we need your team to do. How are you best going to affect that? So they're not photographers. This is something I learned, again, doing flight tests, is as important as it is, as you know, a lot of times there's kind of terms that they use in flight tests. Well, for video and photos, depending on the usage, it's can be required. So if they're doing a data point or a test that absolutely needs some sort of visual analysis, it will be written in as required. There's desired, not required, which means like, hey, if your jet breaks and we're going, you're going to stay behind. And then there's just sort of like, hey, we just want it. So for most flight tests, it's, you know, it really falls in between, in my opinion, like to be flat out required or desired, but not required. You know, if it's just like, hey, we want to get some cool photos of this thing, we would still do it. So most of the time, whether it was when I was at Edwards or any of the other flight test contract work I've done with the Navy, or now because I do have a job as a contractor with Boeing, they look to you. They're not photographers. Even the smartest engineers, you know, even if they're hobbyist photographers, they're still going to look at you. And I remember distinctly one C-17 flight we did where literally the room was like with like air crew, engineers, I mean, like 30 people in the briefing room. They went through their whole spiel about all the flight parameters, and then they kind of looked at us and they go, okay, so how are you going to do that? Here's what we need. How are you going to do it? And we have to do that. So we would go back, specifically talking to your Edwards question. If it was, we need this, how are you going to do it? And we, you know, obviously we had DSLRs, we had video cameras, but like if we had to make mounts, if we had to do brackets, if we had to get something in a position, there were rules about that as well. You can't just slap a camera on an airplane, but we would come up with an answer and then work with the engineers and say, okay, here's where we're going to place our cameras. Here's what we're going to do to get this image or this video that you need for your data point. So yeah, very much like they respected our end and they didn't try to interject and be like, hey, I got a GoPro at home. I know how to do this. Like, here's what, you know, they would just sort of say, hey, this is what we need. How are you going to do it? And we would have to come up with a solution. And that still holds true. I mean, I think the work that I do for Boeing, they have a team up there. They call me when they need me, but I'm kind of able to see the emails and the conversations through my laptop here in California. And I'm included in those if I'm going to be part of the program, even as a courtesy. Even if I don't do the work, I'm still included in the emails. And the same kind of conversations happen. It's like, hey, photo team, here's what we need. We're going to need this in 3 months. How are you going to do it? And they'll answer them. You know, the guys up there will answer them and say, here's what we're planning. And they'll say, okay, well, to do that, you got to come out to the aircraft. You know, you got to show us the equipment, where you plan to put it, how it's not going to affect the flight or the people in it for safety, and blah, 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 blah. So, yeah, there's definitely a level of respect when it comes to flight tests with photography. I think that getting past the politics and the budget and the money that's involved, I think there is a level of respect between air crew, engineers, understanding that if they need that data, there's very few people that can do it, and they're going to rely on you to do it. It's not something you can really screw up. So they know that, you know.
So 2 aircraft I have never flown in, and I'm incredibly jealous that you have in the logbook, the T-38 and the F-16, and especially taking photos out of the back. What's it like to take photos out of a Talon and a Viper?
I actually love the T-38. It's just it's a little older. So the F-16 is cool. I don't have a ton of hours in F-16s, but like, I mean, it's just different. The way it was described to me and just comparing, the F-16 really does feel, the way the seat's kind of angled, the way the canopy is, obviously, again, even with the best canopy, and you know this too, like if it's dirty, it doesn't matter how big the canopy is, how wide it is. So I've been on F-16 flights where, you know, like I'm like, oh, the glass is kind of crazed, you know, has that cracking. You know, sometimes you just can't do anything. But the F-16, you literally feel like you're strapping yourself to it, you know, like that it's just a part of you. And the fact that the D models that I've flown in, all the D models, you can fly from the back seat. So I've had that opportunity. It's incredible how it feels. You know, the seat, everything's very tight. So shooting in there is somewhat difficult, I think. I mean, there's other guys that do it too. And, you know, around the world that have flown like myself. And I just, like I said, it's a very tight cockpit. It literally feels like you're strapping yourself to the aircraft. Whereas like in the T-38, it's like a kind of wider, it's older, and you have to, you know, manually close the canopy. So it's just like, I love the T-38. I really enjoyed flying in it. I'm going to have an opportunity here in the next month or so to go to Texas to work with the Air Force on a project, and I'm going to fly in one again. It's been a while, but kind of can still in my mind remember the sequence of like the straps, because it has like the kind of the spaghetti straps down by your ankles that you got to click into, and it's you're strapping yourself to the seat. So it's a little different, but canopy's a little, I'm trying to remember, it's a little high. The rails, you kind of have to wiggle yourself up to shoot over the rails. F-16 is not. As opposed to, say, in the Rhino, when you've flown in a Rhino's a big aircraft. It feels like a big aircraft to me. I've always felt like, even though it's a very powerful aircraft and deceivingly maneuverable, it really does have a ton of just high AOA, things that it can do. I always felt like I was like sitting on the seat in front of the engines, like this big, massive plane behind me. Whereas when you sit in the F-16, like my buddy Sista, he's a TPS grad, so he's had the opportunity to fly quite a few aircraft. And he always said that to me. The F-16, it feels like you're strapping it to your body, like it's just part of you. And I'm sure the F-35 feels that way too, with its controls and the way you get in there. But the F-18 is like you're just sort of sitting in the seat and you're flying this behemoth of a machine. So I've got to feel that more now. And I was lucky. I got to fly one of the few Super Hornets that actually has a stick in the back when I was at Lemoore. So I've actually flown a Super Hornet, which is apparently pretty rare because there's only like a handful that are still left in the fleet with a stick. So it wasn't a design the Navy never really went forward with. But like I said, just overall fun. T-38, just like it's got the little wings. It rolls really fast. It's quick. It feels quick. And it's just a lot of fun, especially if you're flying with good pilots that know how to really fly it. It's a kick.
You mentioned good pilots, and I think like we talked about a little bit before, we're just the ones pressing the button. The people flying the airplanes are the ones that put them where they need to be for a good photo to really happen. How did you kind of hone that ability to communicate? I had a photo flight. It was a flight of a couple helicopters, and the people planning it, one of the senior people kind of came to me and was like, okay, so we're going to put you in -3 as the photographer. And I could not understand why he didn't realize if I'm taking a forward 3/4 photo of other aircraft that I have to be in the front aircraft, the lead aircraft. The reason I mentioned that, something so simple, I realized, not everyone has this experience. I'm really fortunate. This is what I love. This is what you love. How do you communicate that to aviators? That they know how to fly. They know how to fly forms, but sometimes flying forms is not flying forms that are going to necessarily yield good photos or good video. How do you communicate that?
So it definitely falls more into the outside the military. So flying with law enforcement, as I have with helicopters, some of the other things I've been lucky enough to do, those folks are definitely not, for the most part. I mean, there's some that have done photo shoots before, but most of them have not. So, I've had a couple incidents with law enforcement where not comfortable at all even flying in formation because it's just not something they do. So, hey, you're literally a mile away. I can't see your helicopter from there, even with the big lens. You have to kind of coax them in. But again, I'm not the type, never is my style to have anybody do something they're not comfortable with, and clearly never would do something that's not safe, but comfort is part of that. So I've had a few flights where it kind of just didn't work great because the pilot was just not comfortable. You have one pilot flying with you going, I don't know why he won't creep in farther. And pilot to pilot, they're trying to, talk to each other and say, you can come in here, But I'm always there going like, hey, don't have him do something. You can always land. Try another day, different pilot. But in the military side, same kind of thing applies. Everybody in the military, including like yourself, are trained to fly formation. So there's a little bit more comfort there, getting close to each other. Doing photos, I've had both kind of times where, you show up and they've never done it before and you kind of have to talk them through it. Like you just said, where you're kind of like, hey, you can't be here. And that's my job. I'll either do hand signals or I don't ever talk to them, as I'm sure, I'm not sure when you're flying what you do sometimes, but like for photos, I will talk to my pilot and use hand signals, but I'm not like over the radio talking to another Rhino pilot or an F-16 pilot going, move up, move down. I'll use hand signals if it's close enough where he can see me, move in, move up, in, out, whatever. But I'll just say to my pilot, hey, have him go 10 degrees up, move out a little. What I try to do is, again, I've had a couple people tell me this. Before I fly, one thing that I'll do with the pilots, especially if they're not camera people, is on the ground, I will say, let's walk outside. You take my camera. I usually fly with a 24 to 105 lens. I'll say, let's go outside, and you take the camera out of my hand and zoom in on a car in the parking lot. So you can see how close or how far I can get with this lens. This is the only lens I'm bringing. Nothing's going to change back there. So that helps a lot. I've had many pilots say that really gave them a lot of perspective as to what reach might. Because a lot of guys, like, they don't know. And they'll think, well, you can zoom in to, right into they've seen photos in magazines. And they don't know what lenses do what or what cameras can do. So that one thing sometimes actually helps the pilots understand. Like, okay, that car's 100 feet away and I can zoom in this close to, that helps them. Other pilots have done this before. It's pretty much like you said, you do the brief. They've done photo flights before. I will say the other part of most of my work with the military, there's a phrase that I usually have in the emails that go around before things get approved, is Scott is going to be there on a not to interfere basis with any regular training. I don't normally ask for photo flights. I say, I'll sit there, I'll be in the back, You do what you need to do. And I will grab shots, if you're cool enough to say like, hey, going out from takeoff to wherever they're going to work and coming back, we can grab shots in that transit time. Usually it's not 2 minutes. For example, at Lemoore, most of the flying they do out of Lemoore is a good 30 to 40 minutes away, depending on where they are in the desert. So there's tons of transit time where then I can say to the pilot, hey, can we, normally they'll just do a relaxed formation because they're just cruising out to where their military operating area is. But the pilots will talk beforehand. They'll go, we'll just fly a little tighter. We'll move around. You want me here? We'll move around. You want me to do a brake turn? We'll brake, Then they go do what they're going to do on their mission. And then I'll shoot where I can. But I'm not trying to, again, it goes a long way with the public affairs folks that get involved, and it goes a long way with the ops folks. When you're saying to them, look, I'm capable of getting what I need without messing up your day. And occasionally they will come back, go, no, we'll go do a full dedicated photo flight. Okay, great. Again, with the helicopters, with law enforcement and such, that typically is what happens. Because, for example, like you take LAPD. LAPD, they don't fly around together. They have airships up all the time doing patrol, but they're not doing it together. They have one in one part of LA, and there's usually three, and don't quote me on that, but there's I think it's three that kind of are in various spots in the city, and LAPD uses their helicopters as almost like a patrol car. They're always up. They don't wait for a call. They're always flying. So it's not normal for them to launch and be like, hey, we're going to go do 3 helicopters in formation around the city of Los Angeles. So they would say, when we leave for our shift, there's a period of time where all 3 helicopters return and 3 other ones go back out for their shift. So we can kind of hook up for a few minutes, do that, and then you can fly in the back seat while we're doing our 3-hour patrol. So I just sit back there and enjoy myself, watch them do their calls and their pursuits and stuff that they do. And then they'll try to connect with the helicopter if it's slow again and say, can we join up for a few minutes so Scott can grab photos? Again, there are law enforcement agencies I've flown with who are like, no, we're just going to go up and we'll put 2 helicopters up for as long as you need. Another quick example, I'm supposed to work with LA County Sheriff again here probably this week. It's raining here in LA, so maybe not. They're flat out like, what do you want to do? If you want us to put 2 helicopters up, we're happy to do that for you. Not the whole day, but if you need a few minutes, we can take off together, grab your shots, and then you can go on our search and rescue missions with us. And then I grab all my shots in the actual aircraft, the rescue helicopter that we're flying in. So it really depends. Most pilots will listen. Most pilots are not photographers. The military guys tend to understand a little bit better. And even if they don't, I'm not sitting there going you've got to do X, Y, and Z. I bring in my briefing cards. I bring in kind of what I'm looking for. And you and I spoke about this again offline. I am not the type of guy that's going to walk into anybody and say, I've never seen this shot before. Let's try to do this. It's not worth it to me. I want to be the guy to get this shot that nobody's ever seen of a F-16 doing something that is going to put everybody in some weird position to, it's all been done before. That. You're a pilot. There's nothing you can do hasn't been done before. And if you are trying to do that, you're putting yourself and everyone else, I believe, at a risk. So I come in with what I'm looking for, sit down with the pilots. Usually they all agree. If they don't understand camera mechanics, that's where I'll sort of say hey, let's walk outside. I'll let you play with the camera. You can see what I'm looking through, what I'm able to zoom into. That's the distance we're playing with. They go, got it. Pretty much usually works out.
I don't think I've ever heard that technique or seen that technique used where literally handing someone the camera. I like that a lot. That's something I'm going to start doing now, I think. I had a brief recently where part of my slides, it's only 4 pages. The last 2 pages are a bunch of sample photos. And it's, this is what I'm going to call this specific photo. If I say, a break-in versus a breakaway or a 2-pole break versus a 3-pole break, it means something. This is what it means. And I had a pilot recently, this guy, Black Diamond Jet Team, flew Navy jets for a very long time, very, very experienced guy. And he's like, and he's done a lot of media flights and photo flights. He said, I've never had a photographer show me sample photos. This is what we want to create. And it was funny because I will be honest, I got that idea from another photographer. So it's always interesting to kind of...
And that's 90% of what I do. I don't necessarily have full briefing cards, as you know, like I said, I saw what you sent me and that you have access to certain I'm sure I could go on Google and print out blank cards like that too. The Navy cards that you guys carry around, things like that. But I usually bring in examples, even if they're not my photos. I will bring in Jim Hazeltine or Fuji Ramos, somebody's photos. I'll just say, this is really cool. This is something I want to try to do. It does create they seem to get it when they're seeing it as a photo. And then of course, you have the airplanes on the sticks, and sometimes it'll be something simple drawing little X's and then little Y's and like you do. But the visual part, I found that that's the most effective. Here's 10 photos. Again, I'm not like, I don't have an ego enough to be like, it have to be my photos. Like, I'm like, hey, I saw this in a magazine. I think this looks cool. What do you guys think about trying to do it? And what are the mechanisms that, mechanics to do it? I know mostly what it takes, but I think that's helpful for pilots, and they like that, in my opinion. I've seen it too, where, like you said, they go, oh, that's a cool photo. Yeah, let's do that. We understand what happened here. And again, I'm not a pilot, so I'm not sitting there saying to them airspeed and this and this. I'm like, here's what I'm looking to do. How do we do it? And are you guys comfortable doing it that way? So usually it works out. Like I said, the worst thing that happens is they're not understanding like the mechanics of the camera. I've had a few flights where guys were like constantly pulling G's, and I'm like, you guys, this isn't gonna, you got to kind of ease your way into positions sometimes, as opposed to yanking the jet everywhere. And those are the guys that, I'm still friends with them, and I joke with them all the time, like, you guys suck type of thing. Like, you guys don't know what you're doing. Those times are where it just becomes, hey, just so I'm sitting in the back, I'll say to him on the intercom, if I need this other shot, I don't necessarily need you to be pulling 6 Gs to get me there. Let's think about it. And you've done this, I'm sure, as well. Like, example of that is an aircraft going into the vertical. If you're pulling at the same rate that he's going to pull, it's just really tough to lift a 10-pound camera under that kind of G. So to me, I've always said, like, maybe he starts under us a little bit and climbs through the canopy, or we delay our pull a little bit, a little more shallow. So he starts his vertical, and then we start, but if you pull at the same rate, and pilots usually understand that, but they don't always. So it's like, okay, I didn't get anything there. Can we do it again? But hey, maybe delay your pull and not as hard, and I can get him as he's coming through, across, and it only takes one picture, right? I mean, you don't have to sit there and get 50 times. It's 1 or 2 good ones, and then you got it. So again, other guys might do it differently. Look, I'm going to be 50 in a few weeks. I don't necessarily care to be pulling 7 Gs anymore. If I can get the job done, I'm there to do a job. And even if I go work with the Air Force here, I don't need to go fly in a T-38 and go rip roar. It's fun for a few minutes, but really I'm there to do a job for a publication. And I have some shots in mind that they're looking for, and I have some shots in mind that I'm looking for. So to me, I'd rather make sure I get the work done. If the pilot's like, hey, you want to go have some fun for a few minutes and, do whatever, cool. But I don't need to do that to get my work done either. So, I mean, maybe other people are going to listen to this and think it's weird that I say that, but I really don't care about that anymore. And it's fun. But to me, I'm there to do something, and everything else that comes with that is a bonus after. But like, I don't need to say to the pilot, yeah, I need to go do an hour of low level, unless that's part of their flight, what they have planned. And then they go, okay, I'll be in the back. You know where to find me.
Sure,
I'm the
sure.
Bob in the back.
Scott, this is if there ever is such thing as a leading question, this is a leading question, because the only reason you and I know one another is because of a guy that I consider my mentor, Greg Davis. But who are the people that you consider your mentors? Who are the people, the photographers, or the...
Same. Greg and I had a weird way of crossing paths, but Greg is definitely one of them. I had mentor... Let's step back from Greg for 1 second. When I spoke earlier, mentor to me, from a photography standpoint, I'm pretty much self-taught. I learned from reading the magazines, looking at books, and admiring that kind of work. Again, like a guy like Heater Heatley, Ted Carlson, who I've never met Ted personally, but he's still there. He still does this work. But those kind of people that I saw their photos, in a way, I kind of consider that like admiration / mentorship, because I've now become friends with a lot of these folks. Eric Hildebrand is a name that I'll throw around again. Eric is pretty well known in the Navy communities. He did the Fly Navy Centennial of Naval Aviation, fantastic book years ago. Eric has done 5 or 6 books. He and I had opportunity to work together after I knew his name and crossed paths with him. But like, these are the people that I looked up to. But really, when it came to quote, if you're using like you're saying mentorship, it's probably Greg. And Greg worked at Edwards way before I did and had left. And the person that I replaced at Edwards was another one that Greg is very close with. So I sort of took his spot because he was moving on, left the job, and I got his job. Didn't really know Greg at all. Kind of casually introduced myself via Facebook, I think, at the time. And we just never really connected until I actually left Edwards. Once I left Edwards and started my own business, he and I became really close. And as I mentioned to you before we started talking, like he was texting me right before we jumped on this. So it was like, from knowing who he was as a prior Edwards flight test photographer and knowing his background as a combat cameraman and all the great things that Greg has done, and public affairs officer, I wasn't really close with him while I worked at Edwards. It was after I left. And it was literally like the week after I left, he texted me and said, I heard you left. Like, what's going on? Let's talk. And from that point on, we don't talk as much as I would think we used to, but we talk a lot. His experience alone, as you've seen, I'm sure, he has a knowledge from the various types of jobs he's done of how to do it right, but also how to deal with the public affairs folks, deal with the bureaucracy side of things, because he's been on that side too. I don't honestly I don't think there's been conversations where Greg and I sit there and talk about cameras necessarily. I really don't. The last 10 years, let's say, we don't really talk about put the camera here. I mean, if I asked him, he would tell me, but it's more about just doing the right thing, doing, how to work within the bounds of whether it's public affairs people or aviators or whatever. That's what he's really, really helped me with. And even when it came to writing my book or whatever, I mean, he had written a book. So it was hey, here's what I think you should do. Do I always agree with him? No. And I'm sure he doesn't always agree with me, but he is that guy, just like it is for you. I don't really have, on the photography side, at least, I don't really have another person that I sit there and go, yeah, this person really spends hours and we just talk about whatever, whether it's this magazine or what this person might be doing, or, we talk about everything. But just through those conversations, it just becomes like mentorship. The one thing he said to me, and I know he said to you, always make sure you're trying to help the next generation, try to give back. And I do that. And I think that's even how we met, in a sense. It was he was already helping you. I ended up using a couple of your Navy photos in my book. It was he was talking about you all the time before I even knew you, talking about how he was trying to help you navigate the photography side and doing the aerial photography and things like that. And so he kind of instilled that to me too. So there's been a few people, I get messages all the time, private messages on Instagram, Facebook, hey, I want to do this. I want to get into a magazine. I want to be published. What do you think? I had one, no joke, this weekend, because it's Monday, it's Monday, holiday weekend. I've lost track of days. It was this weekend. Where it was what do you think the chances of me getting in, flying with the Navy type of thing, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just again, it's a loaded conversation, but, I'm willing to help if I can. I don't think I can in this situation, but that's what you have to do. And that's one thing that Greg's been really big on. If somebody asks, I'm not the type also, just so you know, and we've talked about this as well. It's if you said, how did you shoot this? I'm going to tell you. I don't care. There are some photographers I know that would say, I'm not telling you how I did it. I'm not telling you what technique I used. Go figure it out. This is, I had to learn. No, I don't care. I don't care. I will help anybody. I will write emails to other people to try to help someone get through the door if they needed that help. And if it's again, I don't consider myself an expert at anything. So if somebody says, how did you shoot this? I'll tell them. There might be a better way. That's great. But I'll tell them how I did it. And if they want to use that, fantastic. If they don't, they don't. I don't care.
Scott, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I feel exactly the same way. And I don't know if Greg had told you the story of how he and I first met. And for anyone that's wondering who Greg L. Davis, give him a Google. He's a pretty legendary photographer and very good at what he does. But the reason I mention it, you mentioned a couple big names, and there were some people that when I was first getting started, it was kind of funny. I just got back home from being home at Christmas, and my mom still has the 3.2 megapixel Kodak camera she first gave me. It's still in a cabinet somewhere, and we pulled it out and looked at it, and that's what started this whole obsession, right? But it started with flying, and I wanted to document flying because it's you get to see some cool stuff, as you know. And when I got a little bit more serious about it, I was getting my master's at UTSI, and I reached out to a bunch of photographers, and he was the only one that reached back and said, hey, yeah, I forget exactly what silly question I had, and there's plenty of things that I know he's probably rolling his eyes as he's like, how do you not know this? But he's very polite and very nice. And then I've had some weird, kind of moments where, just like you talked about, there's some folks here locally in Pensacola that, kind of up and coming aviators in naval aviation that enjoy photography and have asked me questions. I'm like, yeah, I will tell you anything, because if you use that knowledge to go out and get a better photo than me, number one, that's awesome, and that makes me happy. And number two, it's motivation for me not to get rusty and rest on my laurels, and I want to do cool things too. So it only makes all of us better and safer and all that stuff.
There's a part of this too where I don't understand why not. It's hard enough to say make a living doing this, is a stretch to me. I mean, Eric, bringing him up again, Eric and I had dinner years ago, and Eric had left doing the books and the freelance and the stuff that he had been doing for years, and he started working in flight test. So he's the lead photographer at Pax River for the Navy now. He's been there for quite some time. And when he and I met in LA, he had come in for something or other. He sort of said to me, I'm out. Like, the game has changed. I don't want to keep chasing after this. If you want to do it, go for it. Like, good luck. And I didn't understand at the time what he meant, but I get it now. So to me, when people reach out to me or you or Greg or whomever and say, hey, I'd like to get published in a magazine. Can you help me? Or what kind of camera should I get? Or how do I even talk to a pilot about this? I always say, like, what's your goal? I mean, you're in the military. It's a little different, right? You have different rules that you have to follow. But for somebody like, let's just say in my world, that's like on the outside that says, I want to do what Scott does or what Hildebrandt does or any of these other photographers. The first thing I always say is, like, what do you want to do with this? Is it about making money? Because trust me, it's exceedingly hard, which was what Eric's point was when I met with him years ago. It's like, the game has changed. It's not like it used to be. There's still a way, but if that's what you think, then that's number one. Number two is, do you know how to run a business? Do you know how to actually, like, I don't mean this to sound horrible, but a lot of the photographers that I've seen, all they care about is flying. All they care about is their photos, but they don't know anything about how to deal with people. And that to me is a problem, because to me, you're going to be dealing with public affairs people. You're going to be dealing with, if you're trying to sell your work, let's say from a licensing standpoint, from corporate communications or marketing folks. And they don't care what kind of camera you have. They honestly don't. They don't care how you get the photo. It's what they need to do to get their job done. And, prior to working in the field, I was in sales side, in a sales background and a marketing background. So I kind of came in with a business, in my head, like, how to deal with people. I was a salesperson, so I was in front of people all the time. Other than doing the photography, now I also do real estate. I'm in front of people all the time. And I always try to tell people, you can take great photos and you can do the coolest stuff out there. But if you don't know how to deal with people, if you don't know how to be professional, if you don't know how to be courteous, treat it like any other business, then, but that's kind of the questions I always ask, like, why do you want to do this? Do you just want to see yourself published? That's fantastic. Great. Do you just want to post your photos on the internet so everybody can give you kudos? Great. That's cool too. You just want to go to air shows and maybe get media access to air shows. So, like, I used to say, I don't want to shoot a bunch of heads. So great. There's always something for everybody, right? But there's just people out there that aren't as helpful. And I've just never understood. I kind of laugh at it in a sense, and it is something that Greg and I talk about all the time. It's like when people start fighting with each other on social media in the aviation community. And I'm like, what are they fighting about? Like, this person stole I understand you don't want people stealing your photos and that, but I always kind of wonder, like, it's out there, it's on Facebook, it's there for anybody to take. You put your little watermark on it, great. But, like, what's going to happen? Did you think because they took that photo and used it on their stupid Instagram account that puts every aviation photo that you're going to lose thousands of dollars now? You're not. So it's context to me. And it's like, why not help someone out? I know what this game is, and I know that there's no harm in helping someone because, like you said, I would like to see someone succeed. I'd like to see someone, Greg has mentioned this a lot recently. There aren't a lot of younger people in the civilian side, at least, that are out there pursuing this because they're just, everybody has an iPhone. So why would someone invest in camera gear and in aviation photography is already a niche. So there's just not a lot of younger people that are, like, pursuing this. And I kind of feel like we all sort of owe it to, we love aviation and we love photography, help someone out. I would say 50-50. I get messages and DMs where it's they think I'm in the military, which I could immediately correct because I'm not, and I don't pretend to be. I always say to people when they say, like, hey, thank you for your service, how do I get to do this in the Navy? I'm like, first of all, I am not in the Navy. I am a contractor or a civilian, depending on what hat I'm wearing that day. And I'm just there trying to help them look good. I'm trying to promote the military, the Navy, Air Force, etc. That's number one. Number two is, what do you want to do? You want to, is your goal to fly? Is your goal just to take photos? Whatever it is, I'll try to help. But I would say, like I said, 50% of them is just like people that want to join the military. The first thing I say is, I'm not in the military, but my advice to you is to go talk to a competent recruiter. So I'm actually doing the military's job for them. And they don't even know it half the time because I'm pushing kids to go to recruiters. And then the other half are like photography people. I want to get published. I want to do a book. I want to do X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, okay, do you know how to talk to people? Do you know how to ask the right questions? Do you know how to be told no a bazillion times and not get angry and discouraged? Because that's going to happen, that kind of stuff. And that's the stuff that Greg and I talk about all the time.
Okay, so speaking of, gosh, how did you say it? Being told no a million times, which I feel like most of aviation photography has been for me as well, and a lot of hard work. You mentioned a book. I'm going to call it your first book because I have a feeling there'll probably be another one. But Becoming the Rhino is the one that just came out recently, and I will say this both as a photographer, as a military pilot, all that stuff. Number one, highly endorse it. It's an awesome book. Really, really great photos in there. A lot of times, I think my metric for a book, I have Katsu Takanawa's book and Eric Hildebrandt's book and several others. I always look at a photo and think, how the heck did they take that? Because I kind of understand some of the mechanics, and even some of these photos, it's just impressive. You tell the story really, really well. So I was hoping maybe you could kind of tell the story of what it took to get the access, to earn the opportunity to put your camera in those spots, make a lot of friendships, and then be able to tell that story in a really, really meaningful way.
Okay, so thank you. Appreciate that. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of no's. It was constant barrage of disappointment in the beginning. So the easiest way I can describe it is prior to working at Edwards, because I was doing, part-time, I hadn't started my company at that point, Mach 91 aerial photography. I was working, as I mentioned earlier, in the family business. Because I rekindled my passion for aviation and photography, I started pursuing those goals, as I mentioned again, and was just able to go, if I put in a request to go work with a unit and it took 6 months to get a yes out of them, in the company I was working for, which was a family business, I could go do it as long as I was working when I was home. That was kind of the deal. Eventually, though, there was a point in time where, like I said, I got offered this job at Edwards and decided to go do it and left my family business. And then when I left the Edwards job, I had already made some friends in the Air Force and I already made some friends in the Navy. The friend that I had made in the Navy was a squadron commander that I had worked with when I was doing this part-time. The first time I ever actually flew in a Super Hornet was with VFA 154 at Lemoore, and I was doing a project actually covering their sister squadron in the Air Wing, which was VFA 147, which at the time was flying Super Hornets. Now they fly F-35s. That project was for a magazine over in the UK. Well, it's a worldwide magazine, but they're in the UK owned. And it was originally just supposed to be an article about VFA 147 workup. And there's a very long story as to how I got connected with this CO. It's not worth going into now, but that CO is now, one of my dearest friends, and also I would say a mentor as far as dealing with life, like just business life. Not a photographer by any stretch. He's a retired naval aviator, but just one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life, and helps me with a lot of things. But at the time, I had been introduced to him through another pilot and said, hey, Scott wants to kind of be the new Eric Hildebrand. What do you think? And this CO had happened to work with Eric in the past. And he's like, and he knew Eric had moved on to doing flight tests. And he said, look, I believe that we need help. I think that we need help telling our story. At this point, there was no discussion about Maverick coming out as a movie. The Top Gun was still Top Gun. And the history of that movie and the effect it had on naval aviation and all that, there was some level of, the community itself felt that they were always resting on Top Gun to be the driver for recruiting. So he looked at it differently, and he said, I think we could use outside help to help tell the story of naval aviation as long as it's done in a positive way. So I started following around VFA 147 for quite some time during an entire workup cycle before their deployment. And that morphed into the magazine, granting me the ability to do really both Super Hornet squadrons. It was kind of the whole Air Wing, but I really didn't go up to Whidbey Island or do the other squadrons. I was basically with 147 and 154. So I had flown with 154 kind of at the end of that project. It turned out to be a 3-part series in the magazine. So 3 months in a row, which they had really never done, about 15 to 20 pages each month dedicated to a portion of a workup cycle. So home base at Lemoore, up at Fallon, on the boat, whatever they did, I kind of followed them. So if you fast forward, I go to Edwards, I leave Edwards. The same CO is now, he's done various jobs in the Navy. He's now coming back to Lemoore to take over VFA 122. And number one, he was one of the ones that said, I think you should start your own business. I think you should pursue doing this full time as opposed to going back to part time. Now that I'd left Edwards, I literally had left Edwards and was like, what am I going to do now? Like, what am I going to go back to work in the business, the family business, which was in the hotel industry? And he, and then my former boss at Edwards, who is the squadron commander, he and I are still very close. He's also a retired Air Force pilot now. Both of them were like, you should start your own business. There's very few people that do this. You're good at it. You're well liked, blah, 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 blah. And that's how I started my company. When we did that and he took over 122, we basically started out with the idea of doing a magazine article similar to what I had done, which is why I told that story, the CAG 11 workup cycle story. And I even pitched it to the magazine editor. And we were going to do it as a magazine article and basically just kind of tell the story of what VFA 122 does as the FRS, one of the two Super Hornet FRSs. And as we started looking at it, it was like, this is not a magazine article. This is not, you can't write this in 20 pages, because as you have seen now, because you have the book, there is so much more that squadron actually does beyond just training student pilots and NFOs. It's just a magnitude of more. So we kicked that idea around of like, what about doing a book? Well, I had never published a book. I had no idea what that was. Basically, the confluence of things that came together was like, okay, let's do this. There's a whole nother channel that you have to do with the Navy to get approved to do a book, as opposed to being like a quote journalist doing a magazine article. It has to be approved by the Pentagon, Chief of Naval Operations. But then it turned into, well, the only way to accurately do this, do it the right way, is to get Scott in the back of the jet. And the Navy kind of is very, very, very difficult. They do not normally allow civilians to fly in the back of their aircraft on a regular basis. The Air Force, very difficult, but it's a little different. The Navy is just notorious. It's not their thing. And I understand that. I totally understood that. I mean, the fact that I had already done it was lucky, but that was part of a Strike II, because when the Navy lets you fly on, quote, like an incentive flight, which they counted my 154 flight as sort of like that, there you're kind of one and done. So the powers that be between the CO of the 122, the Commodore of the Strike Fighter Wing, who I knew, the Air Boss, who I knew a little bit, he knew me. There was this conversation about how do we get him in the jet on a regular basis to document for like a long time, because to really cover 122, he has to be in bed with us for a long time. Go on all of our debts. They also do the air show demo. They split that with VFA 106. So it's like they wanted me to see everything. And there's, as at Edwards, the Navy has a small amount of flight test engineers at Pax River that fly, and I think at China Lake there's a few, and it fell into a specific category within the Navy's training guidelines that I could also do that. Now, the background of my working at Edwards didn't hurt, because it built up a level of trust that I'd already done some of this training. Obviously, Navy water survival is a little bit different than the Air Force's version, but it was still the same thing in concept. And hey, this guy's not going to get in the back of the jet and start pushing buttons or ejecting people. He knows what he's doing. So it took a year. It took a full year of, we used to joke that on every email that went out about this project, beyond the approval, so Chief of Naval Operations said no initially, and then it circled back, and then they said yes. So that part was easy. Just getting that, the book and concept, the conceptual idea of the book wasn't easy, but it wasn't the hardest part. It was once then it turned into like, we need to send him to water survival. We need to send him to the medical program, blah, 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 blah. There were at least 40 to 50 people on every email. And we used to joke, like, if any one of those people decides to say, hey, I have a question, or no, then the whole thing would stall out for 3 or 4 months while everybody had to get the group together to answer those questions. So that happened for well over a year, where every time somebody would have, some question, and it would take 3 months to get the question answered, just because of the bureaucracy part, which is just the way it is. So we finally, after about, like I said, it was a year, if not a little longer than a year, got green lights from everybody, public affairs, everybody jumped on board, and that's how we started. So that's how, in a very short way, without going into all the negative details of what happened in that year, how everything was finally approved to do the project. And then from that point, then it was just a matter of me sitting down with him as the CO and with his OPSO and scheduling folks. And it wasn't like, the priority was not, again, Scott's going to be up here every week flying in a jet. It was, hey, if there's a back seat available and it doesn't interfere with our training in any way, and Scott's going to be up here in Lemoore, we'll try to get him in. There were many times I went to Lemoore and it was like, hey, dude, you drove it's about 4 hours from me. I would drive up there and they'd be like, sorry, dude. We got to get this student. I never flew with students, by the way. Obviously, it was always with an IP. There were students in other jets, in the flight, but like never flew. But priority was obviously their mission. So there were many times that I would go there and they'd be like, hey, we're too busy. Go take pictures on the ground. Or if you want to go interview someone, go do that. Sorry. I'd be like, hey, cool, no problem. I'll just go home a couple days earlier than I planned on. But it was just that. It was getting through all of those hoops, always making sure that no matter how discouraged, no matter how many times I got told no, I never lashed out at anybody. I mean, I had to maintain that professionalism. I had to trust that the naval aviation community, the friends that I had made over these many years, they kept going to bat for me. I let them do what they were going to do. And then when I got rung in to answer questions, sometimes as hard as it was, I always maintained professional courtesy with whoever it was. And eventually it just finally, like I said, behind closed doors, I have no idea what happened, what they said about me or didn't. But at the end of the day, they finally approved it, and I started doing the work. And again, like I mentioned, that work, we had to figure out timing-wise. The book is an amalgam of, like, if I followed one student from the day they went into 122 to the day they go to the fleet. It's really not that, because logistically I couldn't do it that way, because I live here and they're there. So we just sort of followed maybe 2 or 3 classes over the course of about 2 years, give or take. So I went up to Lemoore a ton, went to Key West, went on the boat, went to El Centro a bunch, because that's close enough to me. And every time I was there, we just kind of document that portion, because each of those places is a detachment where they send their students for specific training to achieve the goal of making it to the fleet. Along the way, there was also other things I did, like covering the air show team, the demo team. So I went with them to a bunch of air shows. There's various aspects of the squadron that people don't know, like they are the model manager for the Super Hornet for the entire Navy. So like any technical bulletins that come from Boeing, GE, any of the major component manufacturers, any new aircraft that show up, they take delivery of them and then give them to a fleet squadron. So there's all kinds of aspects that I had no idea, that the skipper and various folks in the squadron were like, hey, you should talk about this. That's why the book ended up being 300 pages instead of the 150 that I had planned on, because there was just so much information. It's not, a lot of people have messaged and texted me or called me and said, I can't see the book online. Is it like 290 pages of photos? And I'm like, no, not at all. I actually wrote a book. It's a story. The photos are part of it. I don't know. You've looked through it. I don't know if it's 50-50, if it's 60-40, but it tells every detail about what they do out there. And you can sort of extrapolate that to VFA 106 on the East Coast, which is the East Coast FRS. I mean, they similarly do the same stuff, except for the model manager stuff and some various other aspects that they don't do that 122 does. It's a huge squadron. Very interesting to me. So that's kind of how it came. It all circled back from me meeting this skipper at 147, who we became very close. And he's like, I think this is a story that should be told. And we just kept chipping away at, the powers that be to say, like, this is something we should do. And, again, it always became like, we don't need it. We don't want it. We have our own public affairs. We have our own photographers in the Navy, or, jokingly, there's always Top Gun still recruits for us. Again, this was before the movie was even acknowledged that there was going to be a sequel. Some of the things that I would hear were just almost like funny, but they did, there were some parts of the machine that just said, no, we don't need this. We don't care. But I just kept saying, okay, got it, understand. Behind the scenes stuff would happen. And then, they'd be like, 2 months later, he'd call me up and he'd go, okay, we made a move. We're moving forward. Went from a no to, hey, we made some progress in the last 60 days. So keep on keeping on, until even when I was out there doing the work, he used to joke with me and say, Scott, I don't ever think you're going to actually fly until your butt's in the seat and you're rolling down the runway, because there's always somebody that's going to say no. And I get it. Like I said, I don't not understand that it's rare that a civilian gets to do this type of thing. I get it. So I understood why people would be hesitant or fearful, or, God forbid something ever happened to me, somebody's going to have to answer that. But everything was above board. So there was always that answer. It's like, if something, God forbid, did happen, we have every piece of documented paperwork and all the approvals that allow for this. There's nothing that isn't disclosed. Those were some of the conversations that were going on. And I understand that. So, once I was able to understand that this is where we're having these discussions and how to have those discussions, I think people were kind of put at ease. And so here we are, 5 years later, between the year of trying to get the approvals, the 2 years to follow the squadron around off and on for 2 years to the various places, and then the couple of years to actually sit down and take every note, every interview, everything, put it into a book, and then also edit the thousands and thousands and thousands of photos down to a manageable number to give to the publisher and do the layout and everything. That was another 2 years, because of the COVID also didn't help that. There was a huge delay because everybody shut down. So it was about 5 years to do the whole thing.
one of the joys to me, Scott, is that before joining the military, I was that kid with a camera, on the fence. I was someone that, looked up to military aviators and wanted to be them, and also wanted to get really cool photos at the same time. And so I had a couple folks, and I will never forget them because they were very, very kind to me, who let me, visit different military bases or, be around military aviators at civilian airports and stuff like that. And so now that I'm on the other side, when I was at HM-15, now at VT-10, we occasionally will have media that want to come by and take photos or, do whatever. We've had people shoot films on, for example, we have some foreign students here at the squadron, and we had folks from one of our partner nations come over, and they did a really, really red 5K camera that they were walking around with. I was just jealous the whole time. So kind of help tee those guys up and make a movie on their aviators that are training here with us in the U.S. I get to say that, the reason I say that, it's very interesting because now that I'm on the other side of it, I often think, well, how would I act if I was that media that, finally made it through all those gauntlets and finally gets to, have a little bit of access. And to a man and woman, by the way, they've all been awesome, professional, wonderful people. How do you gain that trust? How do you get to it? Because, what you described is much more than a magazine article. Clearly, it's a book, but you weren't just there for a run and gun, just a quick flight and, high fives and back slaps, and I'm out of here and I'll send you guys some photos later. You really became friends with these folks and still are in many cases. What was that process like? Because you need a little bit of trust for folks to open up to you.
Again, great question. I don't know. I'm just being who I am. It's come up a few times. I've always said a couple things, and whether or not this is why, I don't know if this is the answer. I never want to be that guy. I just used it with my buddy this weekend because he was complimenting me on the book, and I said, all I care about at the end of the day when I'm 75 years old is that you and I and people like you from your community are still friends. That's number one. Number two, that you never looked at me when I walked in the room as that guy. I don't pretend. I have a thing about this, okay? When I worked at Edwards or worked for the Navy on contract for NAVAIR that I was on, wherever I'm at, I am not you, okay? I tried. I didn't get the opportunity. I didn't earn a commission. I didn't bust my ass to get where even you are. And I'm certainly not a pilot in the military. So the fact that I have to wear a flight suit every day, or not every day, the fact that I wear a flight suit when I work is because that is the requirement for safety and is what it's like. If you're a fireman, you wear certain clothes, right? That's just what you do. I don't ever want any pilot, any military officer, any law enforcement to think that Scott thinks he's one of us. He's pretending. He's whatever. So I don't know if that's why. I don't know. I know that, like I said, between the Navy folks that I met years ago, over a decade, close to 15 years ago in some cases, my former boss, again, I had a contract job at Edwards, but we were attached to a squadron. So our squadron commanding officer was, technically like our assigned boss. He and I are still very close. He's retired. He lives in Texas. I'm just who I am. And I always would say, I want to make you guys look good. I want to do what you need to tell that story because I have such respect for people like yourself that did get to do this. And I still revere, although I know a lot more on the inside now than I did before, I still revere the job that you do. And my goal, and it sounds stupid to a lot of people, that I am not trying to write an article to talk about the bells and whistles on the Super Hornet, like the Raytheon radar or whatever. That's important to some of these magazines, and of course I will do it. But I really want to get out there, what is a day in the life of a naval aviator like, whether it's a Super Hornet pilot or a T6 instructor pilot, whatever, or an LAPD pilot. I look at it as what would I want to read when I was 15? Well, I want to know what it's like to be in a squadron. I want to know what it's like to fly these jets. I want to know what it's like to go to combat, whatever it is, to be a patrol officer in LAPD Air. That's how I carry myself. When I mentioned to you earlier about being professional, understanding what, how to do that. I love airplanes. Don't get me wrong. I love aviation. I do like photography, although I'm not doing it all the time as much as I used to. But it's not I don't sit there and drool over airplanes. I'm not. It's just it's something I really enjoy being around. I love being out there with those guys. But the fact is I don't know. It's just something I've always felt was the most important thing to me, that when I would get the opportunities, which I know are rare, to do this type of work, that nobody ever looked at me as that guy. And I think you understand what I mean when I say that guy.
We all can think of examples, and you always strive not to be that person. You want to be a value add. You want to bring something to, whatever room you're in, whatever opportunity you get. I look at it as I will definitely never have that exact opportunity ever again. So you want to make the most of it, but you also, you just don't want to be that guy. I can't put it any better than that.
So to me, it's a twofold thing. It's, what am I here for? Okay, so I got through the door, and I'm now allowed to do the work. What do I need to do? What do you need me to do? Like, whether it's the Navy squadron or whatever, what is it you're looking for? And I sit with them, and they say, obviously there's some ground rules there. Like, I'm not like doing sugar puff pieces, and I'm not allowing the Navy to write my work for me. It's got to be my opinion. It's got to be my article. But I'm not trying to stir the pot. So, when I sit with the squadron and I say, what story would you like to, LA County Sheriff is a perfect example. I've already worked with LA County Sheriffs before. And in the past, the work I had done was more of an all-encompassing look at what does their air unit do. They do law enforcement, they do search and rescue, they do all kinds of stuff for the county. This time, I said, what story would you like? What would you like someone to know that you guys do that maybe they don't clearly understand? And they were like, search and rescue. And it just happened to be that the magazine that I'm contributing to was also very interested. So I'm not only working with their air unit, but I'm also working with their search and rescue teams, which are ground-based. And I'm going to probably hang out with them for a weekend, and cover the mission of how LA County Sheriff has dedicated search and rescue teams that go up into the Angeles National Forest and rescue people that drive off the side of the road or freeze or whatever on hikes, along with working with the helicopter. So to me, it's like I'm always there to help them. So that's number one. I walk in the door, I've gotten in the access. What can I do to help you tell your story? After that, it's like, okay, I'm not going to get in the way. I'm not going to be an obnoxious doof. I'm not going to pretend like I'm a fighter pilot or some crazy thing like that. But in that scheme of things over these years, you're right. I've been very fortunate that a lot of these guys I work with, it has nothing to do with the photography or anything. They're still like close friends, I talk to a lot of them all the time. I feel very fortunate about that because like I said a few minutes ago, and I say it all the time to my family, in 20, 30 years, the book's fantastic. All these cool things I got to do, I feel very fortunate. But what really is going to matter to me is that those guys and women still talk to me like, as a friend, because I that's always been, it's not like I'm self-conscious about it. I'm just saying that's what my priority is to make sure I earn that respect. And apparently I have. I don't know exactly why, but it's like I said, I guess I'm just not that guy. I don't know. But I feel very lucky. I said the fact that the book came out and I'm getting texts and messages from Navy pilots that I haven't talked to in years that I didn't even know bought a copy, and text me out of the blue and say, dude, thank you. Or it's so great that they knew I was doing the book, and they knew some of the struggles, some of these guys that I was going through to get it approved. And to have these texts come in out of the blue is like, we know the crap that you went through, and we know how much you could have walked away from this at any time and you didn't. And for either a current or former naval aviator to say, you stuck with it and we're proud of you, that's what I care about. I don't even care if the book doesn't sell all the copies. It's like, that's what matters to me. That's why I keep sharing those posts on my social media, because it really does matter to me. I really respect the hell out of, like I said, what you do, what people like you do. I think it earned that respect, and I still look up to people like you. So to me, it's like, that's what matters, that they look at me and said, you did your job. But I don't know if I did any one specific thing. To me, in my mind, it's just because, like I said, I was always self-conscious about maintaining that professionalism of understanding that, while it's cool that I get to fly, and while it's a weird thing, I'm not you. And I don't want to be pretending to be you, because I didn't earn that.
So, Scott, I know, again, as you mentioned, this was not a fast process. This took a tremendous amount of your time, a tremendous amount of effort on many people as part. But looking back at the very beginning, is there a lesson that you could say? I mean, it doesn't have to be one, maybe multiple things that you learned from writing a book. Because like you mentioned, it's not just about pressing a button and taking a photo. You're telling people stories. Even just by doing a podcast, by listening to people, it has made me, honestly, a better listener. Right. So I've learned a lot from this project. But what do you think kind of takeaways and then maybe lessons learned that you didn't, maybe something you didn't even expect, but looking back on it, it was something that was incredibly valuable to learn firsthand?
I think it's what I've mentioned already, that there are always going to be people that are going to say no. And I think even to this day, it's probably even harder now than it was when I started, doing any of this work, period. That you have to treat it like a business. And I don't mean it like to be cold, meaning like if you understand what it takes to work with people, whether you're in an office or a salesperson. I don't care if you're selling cars or groceries or whatever it is. You know, there was a part of me that always understood that there's not going to be everybody that wants to have me there, but I always tried to maintain the professional courtesy of, you know, being told no, getting frustrated. There were, and Greg can attest to this, there were some situations that I had thrown at me that were so bad, meaning that I was just treated so poorly, but yet I still tried to, you know, whether it was responding to an email where it was just not the nicest email, and be like, but, you know, try to explain myself, tried to justify what my logic was. I've always done that. And I think that's the biggest, again, and I mentioned this before, like when other people ask me, like, what does it take? I said, forget the photography for a second. Forget that you love airplanes. That's the end. When you see my book, or you see something that I wrote for a magazine, or even a photo on my Instagram, that probably was a year of asking to get to do that work. If you don't know how to ask that question, you ain't going to do anything. And that's the lesson. Like, you know, again, I'm not pursuing this stuff as actively as I was. The book was kind of going to be it for me, but then I've now been sucked back into various jobs that I'm happy to do, but I'm not actively going out and trying to hit up public affairs people and say, can I come do this? Or trying to go to magazine editors and say, I want to do this. I have a couple, I'm fortunate there's a few people that I'm still working with that want me to do some work for them. And that's great. And like I mentioned, I'm doing real estate too. So that was my transition plan during COVID was, hey, nobody's flying anyway. Who knows when this is going to end? My wife's been doing real estate for years. I was always interested anyway in it. I like it. So I got my license thinking, well, that's it. And when the book comes out, that will be it. And then I got sucked back in. I got this Boeing job. I have this other magazine that I'm doing work with, Vertical, and some of their other magazines that they own. So, you know, it fell back in my lap. But the point is that when I was knee deep in trying to do all this stuff, like really aggressively going after articles and pursuing squadrons and whatever it was, there were days and nights that I didn't sleep because I was told no on something that I was waiting to do for months and with no real good explanation, just no. You know, understanding that some of the folks that have the access, the granting of the access, they're gatekeepers. So if they say no, that's all they need to say. It's just going to be as simple as no with no explanation. And I'm not super keen on that. I don't accept no just because they say no. I would like an explanation given my background, and I would say that. I would say, like, if it's an operational concern, I get it. If it's a security concern, get that too. And there were nights that, like I said, that I would, you know, have to think about, how do I respond to this? You know, it's not cool, but I never swayed from, you know, maybe it was my dad. I don't know who taught me. Just like, you know, never send off an email in the first 30 seconds when something comes back bad, because you're never going to write what you want. We all tend to still do that. But like, I don't know, man. I think my biggest lesson I've learned is if you don't act like it's a business or you're professional, you're not going to go anywhere. And I just feel like so many people, again, depending on what your goals are, if you're just absolutely love airplanes, like live and breathe aviation, and you just want to go out there and shoot pictures, that's fantastic. Nothing wrong with that. But if you're asking about the other side of things and you just don't understand the other part of this, it just doesn't work.
I think we're all kind of a product, and this is the reason I asked earlier about who are the people that you look up to as mentors or the people that have kind of shaped who you are today. Greg, very early on, always imbued and still does every time we talk, you know, talking about doing things safely, doing things the right way, the legal way, the professional way. And I remember, and this is 2014, so it's not exactly a million years ago. I think it's only maybe 8 years ago, a couple times thinking, yeah, sure, I get it. I'm going to do that stuff anyway. And I just want to focus on this photo or this flight or this particular opportunity. And then now, all those years later, you know, I had a full head of hair before I met him, and I have no hair now. What does that tell you? I'm kidding. Greg and I go to the same hair cutter. But
exactly, I was going to say, he's the same as you.
Exactly. But all jokes aside, right? Like, what do I preach? I preach safety. I preach being professional. All these things that those same lessons that were taught to me over time. Well, now I have experiences and stories that kind of shape who I am, why I am the way I am. A lot of times when I'm teaching a student, you know, I don't know, maybe I read too much into their body language. I'm like, yep, I see the eyes rolling. Like, I get it, man. I remember that other instructor that just talked at me, and here's the reason why I care so much about, for example, doing things safely, doing things the right way. The reason I'm passionate about it for photography, I'll just kind of give a specific example for me. If we have an accident, if we have a God forbid a midair, or something really bad happens doing photos, every one of us, every photographer out there, every person that plays in this space is going to feel it. And we should, right?
Over.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. And so I take that very seriously. When I do what I do, I care if I don't even come back with a good photo, I will make a song and dance and tell all the stories and excuses in the world if that's what it takes. But if we did it safely, if we came back, we didn't hurt anyone, we didn't bend any metal, that's really what matters at the end of the day. And I know some people don't see it from that perspective, but because of experiences in my life and in aviation and the military, I just have a different lens, a different optic on it. I want to do it right, and that matters, even if that's not what sells magazine covers or what makes a flashy photo, I guess. So I think we're all a product of what made it.
100% accurate. Like I said, there have been a few people on the flight test side in general, and I think probably in just the aviation photography side, that have died doing this. To me, there's nothing that like, and I said this earlier about going out and trying to get a photo and trying to say to a pilot, hey, have you ever done this? There's nothing that I need to do to prove to anybody else, nor put anybody else at risk that we're going to do that hasn't been done. Because if you're doing that, you're really probably going too far. But also, again, walking into my job at Edwards, there were conversations about the people that have passed away doing this. So it was in my head. That was the part where I said it was a little overwhelming, what I expected to learn. The stuff that I expected to learn, I thought I knew, but that was the part. It was like, don't screw up. My boss would say to me, and it was like, I took it the wrong way at the time, but I understand your point. We would be sitting in the S-16 trainer that I mentioned, the seat thing. And she'd say, look, if you do this, you're going to break the aircraft and you're going to have to go explain it to the 3-star general. If you do this, you're going to potentially kill yourself and the pilot. That's a huge, mind F, when you hear that way. And I came home from that and I was like, maybe this isn't a job for me because there's so much on you. But I was considered aircrew, and I still look at myself that way when I'm flying. So, I've done other flight test jobs as a contractor, and it's like, I'm not trying to do anything that isn't within the realm of what should be done, what needs to get done. That safety part is big for me. But again, I'm just not, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to say it I don't mean it to be disrespectful when I say I'm not just like, oh my God, every time I go fly or every time I get around an airplane anymore. I don't. I know what the job is, and I know how to work with the people, and I know how to do what I need to do to get the job done and maintain that all at the same level. As excited as I may be, to be there and do that, it's like there's just too much at risk. There's too much that can go wrong to try to chase that rabbit, whatever that rabbit might be for whoever that person is at the time. And I wouldn't fly with someone that I didn't feel comfortable with. I've turned down jobs on occasion where, I go to meet with them and I'm just like, I've even told my wife, I had a job working with a helicopter company. I was super uncomfortable with some of the stuff they were showing me. I came home and I said, I'm not doing this. And it was like, it wasn't easy to turn down financially at the time, but I was just like, this is not cool. I'm not liking what I'm seeing. And they were super mad because I told them, I'm not going to do this. It's not where I come from. Well, nothing's ever happened. And I finished a sentence and I said, yet. And I left. So it was like, I think that's a super important part of it. And I don't know, I don't know if I don't really keep tabs on what everybody else is doing anymore, but I just feel like, as I mentioned in this other interview I just recently did, because of cell phones, because, to some degree GoPro, but really GoPro is not really effective. It's cell phones. Everybody has a camera in their hand. Everybody thinks they can go do this. Everybody can kind of do whatever. You're going to eventually lose that respect of what it takes and the safety part and all the things you just mentioned, if just everyone's running around. And at the same token, I understand then the flip side of where, say, the DoD public affairs side of the house or various other corporate communications, that they're now getting bombarded with, hey, I can go do this. And they have to then figure out, who do we let do this? And maybe the answer is nobody. And as you mentioned, if one thing happens, especially right now, if one bad thing happens, none of us are ever doing this again because they're already stretched thin. I've had these conversations with public affairs officers that I trust, and they have said, we get so many requests now, and we still have to evaluate them all at face value. Do they have a legitimate place they're going to publish? Do they have a legitimate website? Where are they coming from? What's the outlet? Blah, 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 blah. Same directives that they've always followed. But now, what are they shooting with? That's like the new thing. Are they coming out with an iPod on a iPhone on a selfie stick? Or are they like a YouTuber or a TikToker? I've had PALs like, this is what we have to look and research now. But they have to take every request at face value. But there are people probably that I don't know, but my daughter knows, that are huge on social media that the military would let in to do this type of work. So that's great. That's the new world, right? We all live in that. But they're also God forbid something happens. I think the whole thing gets shut down for everybody in this new world, because they're just going to say, this is not worth doing. We'll wait for the next Maverick. When Tom Cruise comes knocking again in 10 years, we'd rather put our eggs into that basket than worry about dealing with these other people, because it's a much bigger outcome for us, in the end, $1 billion movie. But also, we know the commodity we're dealing with at this point.
It's funny you mentioned the recent documentary on Strike Fighter Aviation, and of course I'm kidding. It's not a documentary; it's definitely a movie. And I'm going to say an acquaintance, definitely not a friend, but someone I got to meet and someone you actually know, Kevin LaRosa. I had a really neat opportunity. He was here, and it's not secret. It's something that's been it's on Instagram and all that other stuff. He's filming a movie on the Blue Angels, the Naval Flight Demonstration Squadron here in Pensacola, and had a couple chances to kind of see him up close. Really, really cool opportunity. I got to fly his photographer, Jordan, and then he and his girlfriend flew a borrowed Citabria here at the local airport. And we actually got to do a form flight, me and my airplane, him and the other airplane, up and down the beach. And it turned into like an impromptu air-to-air flight. We briefed it all over the radio and beforehand and over the radio as well. And got some really cool photos going up and down the beach and all that. But the reason I mentioned that, you mentioned that movie. He was the aerial director, I think director of photography. Yeah, let me make sure I get the appropriate terms here. Director of photography for the movie. So obviously integral to making all that on-scene stuff happen. And the competence and the professionalism I got just from flying with this guy for 20 minutes. You could tell someone that respects
Kevin doesn't joke around. That's why he does what he does. Why he did the other movie, Devotion, and he does half the TV shows that involve helicopters or any aviation. His family business, that's his father's, was a legendary pilot. The short, funny story is I went to high school with Kevin's sister, graduated in the same class with her. We weren't like super close friends, but we remained in touch for years. And then Kevin becomes this big rock star. We ended up meeting a few times at Van Nuys Airport for functions and stuff. So I don't know Kevin super well, but we are friends. I've talked to him on occasion, and he is where he is for a reason. And if you look at some of even the behind the scenes footage that's available now from Maverick, the making of little documentaries, you can see the level of like you said, the competence, the briefing in some of the clips. There's not a lot that they show, but my book was going on to some degree on the sidelines of when they were starting to film Maverick. So I heard from other pilots that were actually the pilots that flew in the movie, working with Kevin, but just the meticulousness of it. You don't mess around. They don't mess around at all. And you saw it firsthand. He's doing this IMAX thing with the Blue Angels. Like, it looks like it's like, oh yeah, he's just flying his helicopter, 200 yards away from the Blue Angels formation. That was probably briefed for hours, he's a rock star, and he deservedly is getting a lot of attention. I just watched the movie again this weekend at home, and I literally said to my wife, I truly do hope he wins, or they win the cinematography and the technical Oscars, because they absolutely deserve it. And hearing, like I said, in the background when I was working on my project, like some of the stuff they were doing to create this, movie. And again, the movie is the movie. It is what it is. I hope that the Navy gets a ton of recruiting out of it. It's a great movie. It's a lot of fun. It's not a documentary, as every YouTuber has said, like that's looking for accuracy in every minute. It's not a documentary. It's not supposed to be. It's a fun movie that does a really good job of showing that community and naval aviation in general. It's, as Tom Cruise has said, it's a love letter to naval aviation. It is. But behind the scenes stuff, as you said, it's a premier example outside of the flight test world of what it really takes to do that type of work and to be safe. And, while still getting, to most people, it looks like they're pushing the envelope to get those images, those videos for the movie. They weren't. There were some things they did that dramatically look really cool, but like nothing was just done without hours and hours of safety. And that's how I kind of look at it. I always go back to this, Gemma. I always go back to there's nothing that I'm going to go do today in this helicopter or this airplane that I don't want to be able to not come home at night for. I'm just not that person.
So Scott, we started talking about photography. We ended with the book, but I really want to make sure I kind of pound that home. And I'll, as the kids say, we'll put the links in the description on where folks can go buy your book directly. But for those just listening, where's the right place to get it? Where's the wrong place to get it?
Great. Thank you for asking that. So the right place to get it is through my website, which you'll have the link up. It's mach91aerophotography.com/book. Goes right to the book page. When you click on that page, there's a couple little pictures of the book. One's a regular version, one's a signed version. It takes you directly to my publisher's shopping cart. It's kind of just a transparent switch over. And then the book shifts. If you get the regular version, it just shifts right from them now. The place you can get it, but I wouldn't recommend, is like Amazon and those type of places, because A, they don't have any inventory yet. I was told it's going to be late January, early February. I have no control over any of that. That's just part of the process of publishing. And so like I've had many people in the last 2 weeks since I announced the book was available want the book now. And they've told me, oh, well, I saw it on Amazon. I clicked it. It says pre-order. I'm like, right, you're not going to get it till I don't know when, end of January, early February from what I heard. So prefer you go to my website. I have control over that, meaning my publisher tells me who's buying them. I get a list. I know what my inventory looks like, blah, 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 blah. So that would be my recommendation. Obviously, you can throw in my social media links on there too, because there's always posts. I'm actively promoting the book right now. So that would be the best.
Awesome. Well, again, this what do they always say? Not DoD endorsed. I'm not endorsing anything. I bought my own copy, and I did proudly because it's an awesome book, and it's got some really great, not just a great story, but some awesome photos in there as well. So I highly recommend anyone that wants a behind-the-scenes look.
Well, I will say you did the right thing right there because you're not endorsing anything. My book actually is licensed by the Navy. So my book is actually an officially licensed, for whatever that means. It's an officially licensed U.S. Navy product. I am listed as an officially licensed author / photographer with whatever that office is that holds the trademarks to the Navy. That was another process that I went through for this. That's a good thing. So the Navy actually can, I don't know, endorse is not the right word, but you can say that my book is that. So I'm proud of that because it was a slog to get to that point. It wasn't planned on, but the last year while it was getting published, this sort of thing fell into my lap, and that's where it's at. So I can say that it's an officially licensed U.S. Navy product, the same way that if you went to an air show and go to the kiosk where they sell Blue Angels merchandise, all of those items are officially licensed by the Navy. You cannot sell Blue Angels merchandise without that license. I fall into the same grouping as the Blue Angels and the Navy SEALs and some various other licensing entities within the Navy that are actually licensed. The Navy logo itself is a brand. So I had to, go with that.
Well, Scott, I always end these by asking folks, first off, you get the last word, and I promise I will give you the last word. But just as some closing thoughts, I know you have a lot of exciting stuff, some projects we talked about offline that's on the horizon. I'm hoping this wasn't just like a one and done. I'm hoping that, obviously, we talked about a lot of your experiences in the book this time, but I'm hoping maybe 6-9 months from now, we'll get a chance to get back together and talk some more about aviation, aerial photography, and that type of thing, because it's something, like you mentioned, you've got a lot going on, but you're still living in this space and doing a lot of cool things. So I want to say, first off, thanks for doing this, the first remote interview, so to speak. But second off, you get the last word. So anything, maybe what should I have asked you about before we wrap it up?
No, man, I appreciate doing this with you. I'm glad that we have, through our mutual buddy there, Greg, connected after all these times of hearing about you for close to a few years now and seeing your photography and him trying to connect us either way. I'm glad that this happened. I'm proud of our friendship already taking off the way it has and what you're doing, to promote the Navy along with your day job, and things like this help immensely, I believe, because I think you have the right idea. Not everybody does, and it's hard in this environment to do this, but I think what you're doing is going to, goes above the pale of what the Navy requires, and it's so helpful. As far as what I'm doing next, we'll see. I don't know. Like I said, I didn't plan to be really doing that much aviation photography after COVID, and the phone just started ringing again, and I figured, okay, I'll go until the phone stops ringing. So we'll see. If we're talking next year about another book, I have no plans right now, but I would never say. You never say no. So never say never.
Well, either way, let's plan to talk soon. How about that?
That's fair enough.
Thanks, as always, for taking the time and tuning in to Safe on Deck. Hope you enjoyed this episode. It shouldn't need to be said, but just in case, I'll say it. The views and opinions presented on Safe on Deck are my own and those of my guests, and do not represent the official policy or position of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, or its components. Be well, blue skies, and fly safe out there. See you next time.